I can hear you loud
Thank you.
and clear.
Hello and welcome. You are watching News 9 Live. I am Krishna Kumar, and tonight on News 9 Live on Prime Time, we are discussing what next for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the controversial former president of the United States of America, spent the entirety of Monday holed up at the Trump Tower in the city of New York. He was said to be consulting a crack team of lawyers ahead of his arrest and historic appearance at the Manhattan Lower Court complex for criminal charges on Tuesday. One of those charges include hush money payments to the tune of $130,000 made to porn star Stormy Daniels, who says the two had sex at a celebrity golf tournament a decade before the 2016 presidential elections of the US. Yes, the very election that made Donald Trump the most powerful man in the world. From then and now, the 45th Commander-in-Chief of the US has become the first president to face a criminal case, the first to be arrested by the New York City police, who per protocol will have to take his fingerprints and his mugshots, and the first to be produced before a criminal court. From takeoff to arrival, Donald Trump's journey from Florida to New York has received blanket coverage across the US, and by the looks of it, it may seem like a stunning reversal of fortunes, with many asking whether the sun has truly set on the monarch of Mar-a-Lago. But bear in mind that twice impeached, Mr. Trump is no stranger to controversy. He has emerged relatively unscathed from charges such as as serious as insurrection to criminal conspiracy from the January 6th Capitol riots investigation and the Mueller probe, respectively. So it remains to be seen whether this court appearance in New York could impact Trump in any meaningful way. For what it's worth, it could end up resembling political theater, with the Donald raking up much-needed electoral points before the Republican primaries. And with that, let's dive straight into the discussion. Joining me on the show is Professor Scott Lucas, foreign affairs expert, live from Birmingham, UK, and Ambassador Deepak Voda, former Indian ambassador to US and many other countries. Let me begin the proceedings with Professor Scott Lucas. Talk to us. The simple question I'm going to ask by beginning this discussion is, what next for Trump, Professor Lucas?
Well, I'll give you a simple answer in terms of what will happen in about, 4.5 hours. And that is, in a Manhattan courtroom in New York City, Donald Trump will be indicted on criminal charges. Now, those charges have not yet been publicly revealed. They'll be unsealed by the judge at that time. But we know from reliable sources who have let leading American outlets know that these will be felony charges, or called Class E felony charges, which is the least serious felony, if you can have such a thing in New York State. And there will be 34 of them, 3-4. And I think that number is significant because 34 indicates we're not just talking about one or two alleged falsified business records because of the payoff to Stormy Daniels. We're talking about multiple falsified business records, which could include other matters about Trump Organization and Trump's tax and business affairs. Now, each charge individually, the Trump people will say, oh, it's not that much. We're blowing it out of proportion. 34 allegations, 34 counts is quite significant if this proceeds to trial.
Quite significant if this proceeds to trial. Ambassador Deepak Voda, talk to us from a political perspective. Finding a president in this situation is it has never happened in the U.S.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be with you on your channel, sir. I learned so much from you. You put it across so eloquently, and our guest from England has also expressed himself beautifully. Shri Donald Trump, whom I've met more than once, was a geopolitical arsonist internationally. Within his own country, he came to power promising to sweep or drain the swamp within the Beltway. He managed to do that quite well. Now he's the casus belli of another grave and unprecedented national drama. So amongst the other charges, one is that he directed hush money payments to a porn star during the 2016 presidential campaign, and that could have had some kind of an impact on the outcome of the elections. Boy, $130,000 impacting the US presidential elections? Give me a break. For many Americans who disdain Trump and his riotous single term, the present legal case could be a sign that finally he's being called to account for his rule-crushing behavior and that everyone, even former presidents, are equal under the law. That is the strength of America. On the other hand, is he actually getting equal treatment or is he being treated worse because of his fame and political aspirations? There are no easy answers, sir. The complexities of arraigning a former president under close Secret Service protection means that this is no ordinary case, even if justice suggests that he should be treated like any other citizen. Is an infringement of accounting practices and possible campaign finance violation sufficiently serious to lock up a former president who has already said that he's running again? I don't know, sir. This might just be a potentially flimsy case built on a somewhat untested legal theory linking campaign finance violations to Trump's alleged hush money payment, etc. There were many women, by the way, in the Me Too movement also who called out Trump. It didn't seem to impact on it. Now, this is a grand jury, and I don't want to go into an explanation of what grand juries are, but these are citizens empowered by the United States federal or state law to conduct legal proceedings. The only other country that I believe that has grand juries is Liberia. All the other countries have abandoned this. So what is going to happen to Donald Trump? Sir, I've always referred to him as Mac Donald Trump because of his business acumen and his ability to mobilize people. I
Just like
believe he'll bounce
Borat.
back. And if
Just
at
like
all,
Borat, just
Sir?
like Borat, you refer to him as the McDonald.
and he might just bounce back because sympathy will be on his. You don't lock up a guy for, sir, forgive the language, a one-night stand with some.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's the point you're making. I'm going to take this across to Professor Scott Lucas. Professor Scott Lucas, there is this specter of, is this, entire grand jury proceeding, you had Ambassador Deepak Voda say that, grand jury exists in the US and Liberia. Grand jury indicting a former president, is that too harsh? You've had the Republicans across the board, even people who, Trump, who has fallen out with, former Vice President Mike Pence, even Ron DeSantis, hitting out at this entire grand jury proceedings that have been undertaken against Trump.
Let's take 2 points here. First is, this is the American legal system as it has developed over 250 years, almost 250 years for everybody. Yes, we happen to have grand juries, which is a bit different from other places in terms of the pre-trial phase, but that is part of the American justice system's idea of that it is your peers who try you. It is your peers who decide if the case goes forward, not simply an executive or an official or a judge, your peers. Secondly, and the ambassador, I know he's doing a good job of trying to say, well, there may not be nothing here. We have to wait and see the evidence. We have to wait and see how many cases there are. But yes, falsifying business records is a felony. It's a felony for anyone in the United States to do that, especially if the falsification of business records was done with the intention of committing another crime. To not prosecute Donald Trump for this, to let this slide, would be to give immunity to someone because he happened to be the former president. And remember, we're not just talking about this case here that could lead to indictments. We are also talking about the case of taking records from the White House down to Florida and allegedly covering up that theft. We are talking about investigations both by the Justice Department and by a grand jury in Georgia about election interference and electoral fraud. And we're talking, of course, about the investigations into whether there was incitement of violence around the Capitol attack. Donald Trump is known as Teflon Man, and he's very much at getting away with it. He did so over Trump Russia. He did so over Trump Ukraine. But we need to be very clear what's going on here. This is the question of the integrity of a legal system versus Trump and his followers who are gaslighting. They will portray that Trump is the victim. They'll say that this is unjust, a political prosecution. They will blame the district attorney, the prosecutors, the judge who Trump insulted over the weekend, indeed the entire U.S. judicial system.
Right.
Do you choose
but
the system?
If it was only Trump's followers, I'd be okay with it, Professor Scott Lucas. But you're talking about other people, other Republicans across the board who seem to have taken outrage to this entire proceeding.
Let's explain why they've done that. So if you talk about House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who's talked about outrage, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy pledged loyalty a week to Donald Trump after the Capitol attacks. He criticized Trump, and then a week later, he went down to Florida and pledged loyalty. He got his place as House Speaker in part because of Trump's support. Former Vice President Mike Pence is running for president in 2024, but he wants Trump voters to vote for him. So he goes along with Trump and says this is a political prosecution. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis does the same thing. In other words, they join the gaslighting for their own political ambitions. To represent them as having an equal point of view as that of the American legal system, nah, this is political interference, political manipulation. It's not actually a legal opinion that these men are expressing.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let me take this first to Ambassador Deepak Voda. Ambassador Deepak Voda, if you were on the grand jury and you're looking at all the cases that Trump is facing, that will impact your decision when it comes to this particular case, because here's a man who's been a repeat offender when it comes to the American justice system, American legal system.
Yes, indeed. And we're all human beings. It's very difficult to forget that there's also a trial by media that is going on. So we are seeing this in our own country with an opposition leader. You know what has happened to him. I don't want to take names. You know this much better than I do. Be sentenced, etc., and then is out on bail. He's going to fight, sir. Interestingly, support has come from familiar corners. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, we studied at the same university in France. He's tweeted an image of him clasping the former president's hand outside the White House. Illiberal nationalists, comrades in arms with a message, keep on fighting, Mr. President. We are with you. So what is the challenge at this time? The one hand, a certain fellow called Mr. Joe Biden likes to say that the global situation is a confrontation between democracy and autocracy. But I believe there's also an element of the culture of impunity. Somebody, I think some British politician had come out with an atlas of impunity ranking 163 nations around the world based on data linked to what they call the 5 dimensions of impunity: unaccountable governance, abuse of human rights, conflict, economic exploitation, environmental degradation. America ranks in the middle, closer to countries such as Argentina and South Africa than the group of 7 peers, Germany and Japan. So it's upsetting for those like me, sir, who love the United States just little after I love my own country. America is the beacon of hope, sir. There is that lady standing in New York Harbor. Give me your oppressed, give me your people who are tired, tempest tossed, for I hold my lamb beside the golden gate. What is happening to all of that? There is a process of churning going on. My firm conviction is that he will be sentenced initially, but he will not go to jail. He will get away because he is, by all counts, and I was speaking to my friends in the US about 2 hours ago, by all counts, he is possibly the Grand Old Party's best candidate for 2024.
All right. Professor Scott Lucas, would you care to comment on that? Do you think he's still the Republican Party's best candidate for 2024 elections? And more importantly, I want to understand, how much of an impact is this going to have, whether he's going to be sentenced, or he's going to be arrested or not, in jail or not, impact his chances to become the president again? Because when this controversy broke out before the 2016 elections, it didn't impact his chances back then.
I think it's up to Republicans to decide whether he's the best candidate in 2024 rather than Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, possibly Tim Scott. We have almost a year to the first Republican primary. It's almost 20 months to the election. And with respect, I have to say to you that talking about, how this might affect the campaign, and indeed, maybe Donald Trump will escape going to prison because he's the Republicans' best hope of justice, that's putting your thumb on the scales of justice. The whole point about a justice system, whether it be in India, the US, or another country, is it should be insulated from political interference, political manipulation, or political calculation. And when you say we have to consider this trial and how this trial is conducted by considering what's going to happen in the 2024 campaign, you violate that. If Donald Trump's indicted, he can still run for president. If he's convicted on a felony charge, he can still run for president. You should not, however, let his running for president affect these proceedings being conducted fully and fairly by the judge and the jury and by both sides, the prosecution and the defense.
Right. Ambassador Deepak Voda, I want to understand, how much of an impact will all of this have on brand Donald Trump per se?
He has a very strong core base of supporters. They are going to vote for him. Even if God came down and said he's a terrible chap, he's a friend of Satan, they'll vote for this guy. this is the middle belt, etc., etc. And he has a pretty solid support base. He has no shortage of election campaigning. And all this attention that he's now garnering, this is going to swell the coffers of Mr. Trump and his election campaign, and of course, of the Republican. I tend to believe, sir, that he will not get impunity, as Professor very rightly pointed out. In any country in the world, there shouldn't be impunity. Regrettably, the best is the enemy of the good, and what we are seeing across the world is this culture of impunity, which comes from, which is a product of unchecked power. We have that in the United States, the overweening power of the President of the United States. I don't know whether this will even lead to subsequent constitutional amendment to debate about whether the President should have this kind of power or not. But for the moment, America is going through a process of self-churning, and America has this great ability to self-correct in the middle of a crisis, as it did during the virus we saw most recently, or with the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. I'm convinced that they will find a solution. It'll hurt, it'll be tough, particularly with the eyes of the entire world focused on it. You can expect the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans to mock the American system. But most people like me around the world who believe that the only cure for the shortcomings of democracy is even more democracy, we would like to see some kind of a denouement without in any way weakening the system that upholds the international system of rules, and that is the United States.
Right, Professor Scott Lucas, is beg your pardon, is the United States of America going through another self-correction at this particular moment with Donald Trump?
Thank the ambassador, because those were excellent words, because in my opinion, this is the biggest domestic crisis for the United States, not just since World War II, but since 1865. Because what you have is an individual and those around him who believe they must be better than the system. Indeed, that to serve their interests, they must be able to tear down the system. If they're not checked, they would like to tear down the courts. They will tear down Congress. They have tried to tear down US agencies. They have gotten away with it so far, for example, over links with Russia, because they have been able to take advantage of a damaged media. They got away with it with the blackmail of Ukraine, even as it faced the Russian threat, because of taking advantage of a damaged media. Now we're finally at a point where maybe the system will ensure that they cannot get away with it. My fear is this, that if you allow Donald Trump to escape accountability, the next person who wants to go beyond Donald Trump in abusing the system will succeed. But as the ambassador said, the thing is that the United States has come through almost 250 years of challenges. It still stands. It still has values. It doesn't always live up to them. But there are many Americans who are not just simply part of Trump's base, who want to see those values being upheld again, not just for some Americans, but for all Americans, so that once again, we can engage around with others in the world who want those values for themselves, for their families, and their communities.
Right. Wonderful, Professor Scott Lucas. Ambassador Deepak Voda, in that sense, if America accomplishes this right, and it sort of sets an example for the rest of the world to take after, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It'll be, America has set the example in so many ways, in so many sectors, all across the decades, as the professor was saying, across the centuries. We've all looked up to America. I do know, sir, for example, in India, when there are court judgments, I've seen some of them, they quote some judgment or the other in the United States. Nobody ever quotes a judgment in China or Russia, for that matter. But they do say that this is the judgment given by this court or that court, etc., etc. So America certainly would self-correct. It has this amazing ability to bounce right back. But Trump, I would not write him off. His polarizing political movement, his flouting of democratic norms, his harnessing of an ultra-nationalist band of politics, all this is there. By most indexes, the United States has a healthier democracy than many other countries, but its divisions and political ferment tell a different story. Let me conclude by saying, America will be dragged kicking and screaming into yet another political era, perhaps a better one than what they have seen before.
All right, and with that, we have completely run out of time here on this particular discussion. Thank you, Ambassador Deepak Voda, former Indian ambassador to the US, for joining us, and Professor Scott Lucas, foreign affairs expert, live from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for being with us. And with that, it's a wrap here From my side, we'll be getting you the latest on what's happening with Donald Trump right here on News 9. Keep it with News 9. This is Krishna Kumar signing off. Good night.